Okay. Modim l'simcha to everybody. We were learning today Masechet Shekalim Daf Yud Bet with the half-point marker. Now this Masechet is quite different, quite not the same typical Gemara you're used to. A little bit more complicated. Dapim are longer. Shiurim are longer. Anyway, we're halfway through, so you should feel good about where we've gotten so far. Today's daf is sponsored by Rabbi Moshe Schwartz in honor of Rabbi Gershon Schwartz on his 17th year at site by his children. Rabbi Schwartz loves studying Talmud and teaching Talmud to his many students. And for Refuah Shlema for Rivka Bat Esther from her family. So we're going to start at the very top of our daf with the new halacha. Today's topic, I'll give some background information that will be helpful. Number one, we're discussing situations, and this comes up all across the Gemara, a situation where somebody said something and we're not sure what they mean. And what we're going to try to figure out is, how do we relate to something like that? What are the rules? How do we determine what, or what do we don't even know really how to determine what they really meant, but we make certain assumptions about what they meant. The second thing we need to know is that there's two different types of sanctities. You can sanctify something for the temple, and you can mean, like if I say my couch is sanctified to the temple, I obviously don't mean I'm going to schlep my couch to the temple and that it's supposed to be a couch used in the temple. It means that its value goes to the temple. What I wanted to do is bring the value of the couch to the temple. But if I say I want to bring an animal to the temple or something that can go on the altar, like oil, wine, any of the libations, anything like that, which is what we're going to see, ra'oi lamizbeach, as they say, can go on the altar, that is going to be what we call kedushat haguf. It has sanctity. It itself is sanctified. There's a lot of differences between something that's sanctified. Okay, they call it two different things. It's really, there's number one, does it go to kedushat bedek habayit, which is for the upkeep of the temple? If you say it's kedushat tamim, its value is sanctified, and then it goes toward the upkeep of the temple. If you say it's kadosh kedushat haguf, then it has what we call kedushat mizbeach. It is supposed to go itself on the altar. We're going to have a situation here where someone was sanctified his entire or her entire contents of their house. And now the question is going to be, what if there are things there that could go on the altar? What did the person mean? Did the person mean, well, I'm doing everything in my house, which includes things that go on the altar and things that don't go on the altar. So the ones that go on the altar are for the altar and the ones that don't are just their value. And therefore, we're going to end up with a split that some have sanctity of Kedushat HaGuf. Now, Kedushat HaGuf is very strict because once you have Kedushat HaGuf, it can't be redeemed unless, let's say, it has a mum, right? If it's an animal, it can be redeemed. If it's a bird, for example, it can't be redeemed at all. There is no pidyon by birds. Even if it breaks a whole leg or something, or something serious happens to it, you actually can't even redeem it. So that's a big debate here. It's very serious. If we say it's Kedushat HaGuf, then already all the laws are going to be different. If it's only its value, then of course you can redeem it because all you need to do is bring its value to the temple. So we're going to have a few different categories here. Starting with our Mishnah. Hamakdish nechasav, v'hayu behen dvarim re'uyim lekorbanot hatzibur. You sanctified all your possessions. And in those possessions were things that could be part of public offerings. Now we are communal offerings. We already said yesterday that Rabbi Yochanan is going to explain this Mishnah as referring to the Ktoret, because anything else like animals and wine and oil, those are not only worthy for communal offerings, they're for all offerings, in which case Rabbi Yochanan is going to say this must be referring only to the Ktoret, the incense, which is the only possible item that could go for only communal offerings. So what do you do with those? So what we're going to do with them is the only thing that can be done with them really is you can't bring them to the temple because the temple, remember, the Ktoret has to be bought with the Trumat Halishka money. So you can't just say, I'm sanctifying Ktoret and bring it to the temple. That's not an option. It has to be bought with the communal funds. So therefore, what do? You give it to the people who worked for the temple as their salary. And this goes back to exactly what we explained in the Mishnah yesterday. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. It's only different because according to Rabbi Akiva, you can give it straight to them as salary. You don't have to take their sanctity and move it on to money. Remember, that's what we said yesterday. If you have extra left over in the temple, what do you have to do? You have to put it onto money first, take the sanctity off, and then pay them. According to Rabbi Akiva, now what happened here? Remember, we said this has to be Ktoret, and then we explained that this shows that it must be this Torah that's chulin, because why? Has to be non-sacred, because in this case, you said, I'm sanctifying everything in my house. If it was already sanctified, nothing would happen to it when you said that. So it would have to be a case where it was chulin, which we explained in 2 different ways. This is just good review from yesterday. Either you created the Ktoret, or someone did it without putting it in a kli, and that shows that you don't have to put it in a kli sharei to make it, even though one other opinion said you could. Or we said that maybe it was a case where it was redeemed, right? This was used, it was the leftover Ktoret. They paid them, and before they redeemed it onto money, it was in their property. And then while it was in their possession, they said, oh, I'm sanctifying everything in my house. Then what happens? So the Ktoret that wasn't sanctified before now becomes sanctified. The problem is you can't just bring it to the temple. So what do? So we use it to pay people that are owed money from the temple. According to Rabbi Akiva, what happens then? Now, he doesn't say the continuation. Ben Azai says the continuation, but it would be the same for Rabbi Akiva. So what would happen? Let's say it was in my house and I sanctified all my possessions. I would then pay someone who's owed money from the temple. That money would that Ktoret, the incense, becomes chulin now, non-sacred. Why does it become non-sacred? Because according to Rabbi Akiva, I can take money and the sanctity goes to where? To something abstract. It goes to the work that those people did for the temple. So the sanctity is off of it. Then what would happen? The temple would come in, take funds from that year, buy the Ktoret for the temple, and now the temple has Ktoret, and that works perfectly fine. Amar lo ben Azai, Einai Yamida, you can't do it like that. You set aside money. First, the temple says, oh, here's the amount of money we owe these people in money. You take the amount of Ktoret, right, that I have, and you redeem it on the coins to get the sanctity off, because Ben Azai says you can't put sanctity onto malacha, onto work. That's not something tangible. It has to be on something tangible, like coins. Move it onto coins. Then you can give the Ktoret. Once it doesn't have sanctity anymore, then you can give it as payment. Then, and this is like I said, Rabbi Akiva would agree with this continuation, and then you repurchase it from the new truma. Okay, in other words, the temple comes in and buys it off of that person. Okay, maybe this is teaching you a lesson. Don't start sanctifying all of your possessions if you have Ktoret at your house, because it's a bit of a pain in the neck to deal with this whole process. Next case. What if you have animals that are worthy of going on the altar? Let's say you have Shekalim unikevot, male and female animals, right? Assuming if you have animals, you probably have male and female. So here we're going to have a big machlok at Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, which we're going to deal with a lot of today. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shekalim yimachru litzarch. I'll even give you background before we start. Rabbi Eliezer is going to assume that when I sanctified all of my possessions, if I had just sanctified animals, okay, then we assume they go to the altar, although we're going to see even that maybe there's a debate. But let's assume, since I sanctified everything in my property, what I obviously meant is I want all this to be for Kedusha Bedek Habayit. I want it for upkeep of the temple. I'm not saying I want to bring items to the altar. I'm saying I want to sanctify all of my possessions. I want to go to the temple. But that just means Kedushat Amim, the value of all my possessions. So it happens to be there's animals there. Okay, I get that. So now I'm a little bit stuck, because it doesn't matter what I meant to do. Okay, and it doesn't matter if I only meant their value. The fact is, if you sanctify an animal for its value, since the animal can go on the altar, it has to go on the altar. You can't not bring that animal on the altar. However, I didn't say I was doing it for my own sake. So now what do? And according to Rabbi Eliezer, I really meant just its value. So how do I resolve that? He says like this. Another thing you need to know is a korban olah, a burnt offering, can only be brought from male animals. So the highest, we assume always it's going to be an olah, if we can. And we're going to see a pasuk at the end of today's daf that's going to prove it. So basically, the males, what do? I don't have to bring it as a korban olah because I didn't sanctify Kedushat Haguf. But since it could go on the altar, it has to go on the altar. So what do? I sell it to you who wants to bring a korban olah to the Beit HaMikdash. So I can't sell it to anyone who needs an animal. I can only sell it to someone, my males, to someone who wants to bring a burnt offering. The females, to someone who wants to bring a korban shlamim. Those are the two voluntary offerings that people bring, either an olah, if they want to burn the whole thing, or a shlamim, if they want to be able to eat the meat. And in a keva, a female can't be an olah, so we'll make it a shlamim. So I sell all the males to someone who wants to bring an olah, and then they'll bring it on the altar. So the animal will end up on the altar. I get money now from the animals, from my selling the males for the olah, the females for the shlamim. What do I do with that money? Well, what happened? I designated the animals, kedushat damim, their value, for the Beit HaKabayit, for upkeep of the temple. So therefore, what happens? The value of that I got from the sale, all of that now goes to the temple treasury with everything else that I sanctified in my house, my couch, my table, my chairs, whatever it might be. Rabbi Yeshua doesn't like this. He says, no. We split between the animals and the rest of your possessions. The animals, of course, they have kedushat haguf. You have to sacrifice them. Yeah, what's the problem? Well, any standard, I take an animal and I say, I'm giving this animal to the temple. It goes as an olah. That's the default. But what's the problem? You have females here. So the males are easy. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Schalim atzmam yikaruvu olot. Now, what do? All my possessions, I bring the value to the temple, other than the animals. The animals, I have to actually sacrifice. So the males I sacrifice as olot. The females, theoretically, according to Rabbi Yeshua, and again, we'll see this in a verse later where he gets this from, the females have to be brought as korban olah. But I can't bring a female as a korban olah. So what do? Nikevot, this is similar to Rabbi Elazar's solution, except the end is different. I sell it to people who want to bring a korban shlamim because the animal has to be offered on the altar. But I have to bring it as an olah. So what do? I sell it to someone who wants a korban shlamim. Then I take the money I got from that and I purchase animals for a korban olah, and then I bring them as a korban olah. And then the rest, everything else that's not animals, that goes to Beit HaKabayit, but not the animals, right? Rabbi Eliezer thought even the animals go to Beit HaKabayit. It's just that you have to make sure they end up on the altar, so you have to sell it to someone who's bringing it on the altar. But everything else you can obviously just sell to anybody, take the money and bring it to the temple. Amar Rabbi Akiva. He seems more logical to me, Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Rabbi Eliezer treated everything the same. He said, when I sanctify all my possessions, I clearly put all my possessions in one box, which means it must be they're all going to the same place, Beit HaKabayit. Whereas Rabbi Yeshua distinguished animals this way, right? And the other ones this way. Some people say that they're not talking about animals versus other possessions. They're talking about males and females. Okay, that Rabbi Eliezer said males and females, it's all the same, right? You sell them and then you take the money to Beit HaKabayit. Whereas according to Rabbi Yeshua, the males get sacrificed and the females get sold to become sacrifices, but get sold. So it's a debate about which exactly issue he was bothered by that Rabbi Yeshua split. Amar Rabbi Papayas, Shamati Tivrei Shnehem. Okay, he says, I understand both of their logics. Okay, they both make sense. Okay, again, what can you say about Rabbi Yeshua? I understand animals, stam animals to the, when I said all my possessions, I didn't necessarily mean all to go to the same place. I meant, right, everything else to Beit HaKabayit, and animals, obviously, I meant on the altar. So he thinks it makes sense both ways. Hamakdish beferush k'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, v'hamakdish stam k'divrei Rabbi Yeshua. So he says, and this is what he explains, okay? He says, I understand each one, but it depends on the situation, what he's saying. Hamakdish beferush, if I say specifically, ki Rabbi Eliezer, then it goes like Rabbi Eliezer, that we're going to sit one second, right. If I say explicitly, I'm doing all my possessions, then I say, then I mean everything. But if I'm makdish stam, and I didn't say, in other words, one second, I just want to check one thing. Makdish stam. Right. If you look in the Taklin Chadatin, he says, Makdish beferush, sha'amar behema unichasai lehekdesh. Right. That's what he means. If I say my animals and my possessions to hekdesh, then obviously I meant to say I want the same for everything. And then I would say like Rabbi Eliezer. But if I said stam, I just said I'm makdish all my possessions, then we assume that I meant to split. Okay, you can maybe argue the logic the other way, but that's what he says. Okay, next. Third category. Okay, we saw korbanot tzibur, then we saw animals. What if there's other things that go on the altar, but that are not animals? Like yenot, ushmanim, ve'ofot. Okay, birds, which are different. Okay, we'll talk about that at the very end. We'll see why they're different, why they're excluded from the category of animals, because animals and birds really are both brought as sacrifices, and wines and oils, which are used for libations. Now, here there's a problem with the nusach. It says Rabbi Eliezer in the text, but it really should be Rabbi Elazar, because if it's Rabbi Eliezer, this Rabbi Eliezer seems to match Rabbi Yoshua, who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer before. So therefore, many people change the nusach to say it's Rabbi Elazar, which is a different Tana than Rabbi Eliezer. They're not the same person, obviously. So Rabbi Elazar, now you see why this is like Rabbi Yoshua. He says, sell it to someone looking to pour wine libations, oil libations, or bring a bird on the altar. And with that money, buy an animal korban burnt offering, okay? Korban olah. Ushar nechasim yiplu lebedek habayit. And all the rest of your possessions, again, go to bedek habayit. So now we're going to go stage by stage. We're going to start with the first one, which is hamakdish lekorbanot tzibur, which was the ketoret. And here we have what we quoted yesterday. They quoted from here. Rabbi Yochanan amar ketoret. Rabbi Yochanan said, we're talking obviously about ketoret because that's the only thing that is brought only as a korban tzibur. Amar Rabbi Shaya tipatel be'uma mishal beit avtinas shayanu tel b'scharo ketoret. Let's explain this, that it must be who's the uman? It's the beit avtinas, because they're the people, as I said, we're going to learn about them more in the next 2 pages. They're the people who got the ketoret as salary for their work. My tamid ben Azai. Now, what's the machloket ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva? Remember, ben Azai said you have to redeem first the ketoret onto coins. You can't redeem it onto work, and that's what we're going to see right now because it's not tangible. She'ein hekdesh mitchalel ala melacha ela ala ma'ot. Hekdesh can only be removed by using money and not by using someone's work that they did. Now we're moving to the animals. Taman tanina, and we're going to quote a Mishnah in Tamura. And we're basically going to say this Mishnah in Tamura seems to match Rabbi Eliezer opinion. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer said, stam hekdesh, if I don't specify, we assume it's going to bedek habayit and not to the altar, right? It's going to upkeep of the temple. Taman tanina, and it says there in the Mishnah, yesh bekodshe bedek habayit. These are differences between our topic, bedek habayit, upkeep of the temple, versus kodshe mizbeach, things that are sanctified for the altar. So here's one difference, and the first one is the main one we need right now, but we're going to read a few. Shestam hekdeshot lebedek habayit. Okay, stam hekdesh goes for bedek habayit. If I just say this is hekdesh, we assume I meant bedek habayit. Second difference, hekdesh bedek habayit chalal hakol. You can't take a table and say I'm sanctifying this table for the mizbeach, for the altar. There's no such thing. Okay, so you would have to only certain things, only things that can actually go on the altar can have kedushat mizbeach. Other things that can't go on the altar can't. So, but bedek habayit, you can sanctify anything. Umoalim b'gidulehen. Things that come out, if something is sanctified for its value, for the temple, upkeep, then anything that is an outgrowth of it has a din of me'ila, where misuse of consecrated property. But if you have, let's say, an animal that's supposed to go on the altar, the milk that comes out of that animal, that would be a case of a gidul. The milk that comes out of that animal, there isn't a din of me'ila. If you misuse the milk, you're not obligated because milk doesn't go, it's not offered on the altar. So because of that, there's no din of me'ila. Now, many of them are freshmen say, what are you talking about? What? I can benefit from the milk of an animal that's supposed to be sacrificed on the altar? That seems strange. So they say you can't benefit from it, but it's not under the D'oraita category of me'ila. Some people say maybe Rabbanit, or it's just forbidden b'hana'ah, it just doesn't have a din of me'ila. There's a number of cases, we're going to see this much later when we get to Tamur and other Masechta like that, where we're going to see that there's some things that you can't benefit from, but they're not me'ila. Okay, me'ila is usually benefiting from sacred items, sanctified items, but it's it doesn't, sometimes you can't benefit from it, but you don't have the laws of Me'ilah, which would mean you'd have to bring a Korban Asha Me'ilot and you'd have to pay an extra fifth. If you can't benefit from it, so you might have to pay its value, but you don't have to do all the extra stuff if there's no law of Me'ilah. The Kohanim can't benefit from anything that was sanctified to the temple upkeep. Whereas when it comes to sacrifices, we all know the Kohanim get parts of the sacrifices. They get the hide of the ola, the burnt offerings, and they get part of the meat of the other offerings. So there's benefit to the Kohanim in the sacrifices, but Bedek Habayit, if I say my couch, the value is going to the temple, and then I pay my value of the couch to the temple, the Kohanim don't get any share of that. So those are all there. In the Mishnayot, they describe what's different about them, what's more strict about Bedek Habayit, what's more strict about Mizbech, and what's the same about both. So here are the ones that are different. And what do we say here? Amar Rabbi Chananya to Rabbi Eliezer. This is obviously Rabbi Eliezer. Did Tanina, because what does Rabbi Eliezer say in our Mishnah? Again, we're talking about the first line of that Mishnah. Stam hekdesh lebedek habayit, and that's exactly what Rabbi Eliezer says. Hamakdish nechasav v'ayta be'em be'ema ru'ya al gabei mizbeach. We're just quoting our Mishnah now. Scharim unikevot, if there's male and female animals. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, scharim yamachu l'tzarchei olot unikevot yamachu l'tzarchei zevchei shlamim. Right, you sell the males to people wanting to buy korban olas. You sell the females to people wanting to buy korban shlamim. And then what happens to the money? Because we assume, since you didn't specify what you want to do with this money, we assume stam hekdesh goes to bedek habayit. Stam means you didn't specify. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now Rabbi Yochanan wants to know, what's the reason for Rabbi Eliezer? Talmud Rabbi Eliezer. Ish ki yakdish beito kodesh laHashem b'meh anan kaimim. What's it referring to? Now, when you say you sanctified your house, what does it mean? You can either sanctify your house, the structure of your house, or the contents of your house, right? It's like when you get insurance. You get insurance for your house, and you get insurance for the items in your house. They're two different things. So now we're going to look in Vayikra, chapter 27. You have to read these two verses, otherwise you won't understand. The first verse says, Yudalit, okay? Pasuk 14. Ish ki yakdish beito kodesh laHashem, if you sanctify your house, okay, and it becomes sanctified to God. Okay, this is the important words because it's going to be entirely to God. What does entirely to God mean? Means the Kohanim don't have any part, which means it's sanctified to the Bedek Habayit, which is only for God and not for the Kohanim. Then it says, okay, I'm not going to read the end of that verse. The next verse says, Ve'im hamakdish yig'al et beito, and if the one who sanctifies it wants to redeem the house, he has to pay the value of the house. V'yasaf chamishit kesef chalav ayalo, and he has to add an additional fifth, which is really a quarter of its value. He has to add the whole value of the house plus an additional quarter. That's not the important part. The point is, the second line, if it was referring to the same thing, buy it in Pasuk 14 and buy it in Pasuk 15, they were referring to the same thing. It would have said, Im hamakdish yig'al oto, it. You wouldn't need to say his house. We already said the topic and the subject of the previous sentence was his house. So therefore, the fact that it repeats his house twice must mean that each time it's referring to something different. So that's what we're going to read inside. What's this verse referring to? If it's the house itself, if you redeem the value of your house, that's the next verse. And again, it should have said, if you redeem it, and it didn't say it. It must be, the first verse is talking about the contents of the house, and the second verse is referring to the house itself. And what does it say in the first verse? Kadosh laHashem, which means it all goes to God, which means it's not sacrificed on the altar because some of that goes to the Kohen. It must be its bedek habayit. Mikan shestam hekdesho lebedek habayit. Okay, so here you get that it goes to bedek habayit. Amar Rabbi Zera. Now we're going to have three different versions or a three-way machloket about in which case do Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua disagree. Okay, so Rav Huna, and two of them are going to be in the name of Rav Huna Amar Rav. Okay, Rav Huna is Rav Huna. So Amar Rabbi Zera, Rav Huna b'shem Rav, b'meh pligin. What's the case that they disagree about? B'makdish nechasav. It's if you say all my possessions are sanctified. Aval b'makdish edro. But if you say I'm sanctifying my flock of animals, then obviously what? Although we'll see in a minute, maybe it's not so obvious. But according to him, it's obvious that what? Kol amamodeh shulam mizbeach. Everybody agrees, even Rabbi Eliezer, who says stam hekdesh, if I didn't specify, it's lebedek habayit, unless all I sanctified were animals. In fact, the way I described this case was it's complicated because you sanctified multiple items that theoretically you would say maybe those obviously are Beda Kabayit, but maybe the animals are for the altar. Comes Rabbi Eliezer and says, no, since they're all together, we're going to assume you meant Beda Kabayit for all of them. But if it was only your flock of animals, then obviously you must have meant for the altar. That's the first reading. But not everybody agrees with this. Aldate Rabbi Ba, Rav Huna b'Shem Rav. He said in the name of Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, Ma pligin b'makdish edro. Aval b'makdish nechasav kol am hamodesh hu lebeda kabayit. He said, no. If you keep it all together, animals and possessions, even Rabbi Yeshua will agree in that case with Rabbi Eliezer. Obviously, stam hekdesh lebeda kabayit. The machloket is if you said my flock and you didn't specifically say for the altar, then Rabbi Eliezer is going to say your flock, you must have meant Beda Kabayit because stam hekdesh is Beda Kabayit. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, it's animals. Animals go on the altar. Obviously, those animals you meant to go on the altar. And that's when they have a machloket according to this. So the Gemara is going to say, Aldate to Rabbi Zera Nicha. Rabbi Zera makes a lot more sense because that's how we explain the Mishnah in the first place. Bekasha al de Rabbi Ba. Behema lo lemizbeachi. How could you possibly say, I'm doing my whole flock of animals? You're only talking about animals. And Rabbi Eliezer is going to say, you didn't mean for the altar? That sounds very odd. Now you have to change the nusach a little. There's a bet there, which goes to the Gra. I'm going to read according to the Gra's nusach. Hamakdish behema lemizbeach, omer lemizbeach, ve'lama satam ha'ish hazeh, shehu komer lo yeh ela beda kabayit. Here comes the answer. He says, if you want to do it for the altar, then you say for the altar. People, again, this goes back to psychology. What would someone, if they wanted to say something, what would they say? I don't know if it's exactly psychology, but it's sort of why do I say psychology? Because it's what's in a person's head. A person, we assume what their thinking is Beda Kabayit, unless if they want to do something that's other than the default, they would specify, right? That's where the psychology is, right? If you're doing what's obvious, then you don't need to specify. But if already you're going to say, if you want to do something different than what's obvious, then you have to specify. So stam hekdesh is Beda Kabayit according to Rabbi Eliezer. And therefore, if you wanted to say for the altar, you would have specified for the altar. And therefore, even if it's just a flock of animals and it's all animals and you didn't say anything, it must mean you meant Beda Kabayit. But Rabbi Yochanan comes and has a third option. Lo shnea. Hiya makdish nechasav, hiya makdish edro, hiya machloket. The machloket's actually in both cases. Whether it's the flock, whether it's everything mixed up together, no matter what, they're going to have a machloket. Okay, so we have three options as to which case do they actually have a debate. Rav Huna b'Shem Rav says, Rabbi Abba b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan, he also said, Kodshe Beda Kabayit, shepoda'an tmimim yatz'u lechulin. Okay, now what if I take Beda Kabayit and I redeem them? When the animals, now I'm talking about animals, when the animals don't have a blemish, remember we talked about, if something is sanctified, Kedushat HaMizbeach, you can't redeem it unless it has a mum. But in our case, we have a case where we're saying the animals are not Kedushat Mizbeach. So can you redeem them? Do they become fully chulin when you redeem them here? Okay, do they become chulin or are they only chulin if they have a mum? So according to this opinion, if they're sanctified for Beda Kabayit, like Rabbi Eliezer would say, then if you redeem them when they're tmimim, they actually become chulin. Okay, so I sell my animals for someone who wants to buy a korban ola, right? That's what I did with my Shekalim. I sell them, my male animals, according to Rabbi Eliezer, to someone who wants to buy it. Now, they buy it, but they didn't yet sanctify it, right? Soon, maybe a few minutes later, they'll say, I'm sanctifying this for a korban ola. Is it actually chulin in between, in that in-between time? So according to Rabbi Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Huna in the name of Rav Huna in the name of Rav, yes, it's chulin. Manita Amrakin, and they're going to prove it from Mishnah in Torah also. This there, it says, Vladan v'chalavan mutar lachar pidyonan. It says, if you redeem it, okay, this is one of the cases where we're going to have the kodshe bet. One second, this is in kodshe. One second, I want to just check one thing. Right, these are animals that have kedushat damim, right, which means their value is sanctified. It said, anything that comes out of them, their vladot, if they have offspring, or the milk that comes out of the animal, is permitted after you redeem them. And what do they assume? That they're talking about even if they're tmimim, even if they don't have a mum. Okay, now we're going to see that maybe some people think, no. Only if they have a mum, not if they don't have a mum. But he says, it just says it simply, it must mean even if they don't have a mum. Rav Chizkiah, B'Shem Rav Chisda says, no. Tipatel, explain that case, being Shepda'an Tmimim V'Humamu. And yes, Gita, it means if they produced offspring or milk after they were redeemed. It's exactly what it's talking about. So he says, no, it means if you redeem them when they were Tmimim, they were fine, they didn't have a blemish, but then they became blemished, then you can use, then the Vlad and the Chalav is mutal. But not if they weren't. It's true, you can redeem them before they're blemished, but only when they're blemished, you're allowed to use the offspring. That's how he explains it. And now we're going to bring a proof that it's only when they have a mum. Amar Rabbi Yossi b'Shem Rav Chisda matnita amra kain. The Mishnah also says this because when the Mishnah describes the differences between kodshe mizbeach and kodshe bedek habayit, it says about kodshe mizbeach. Okay, now we're talking about the flip, right? Where it comes to bedek habayit, v'ladam v'chalavam mutarim la'achar pidyonam. But v'ladan, it says by kodshe mizbeach v'chalavan asur la'achar pidyonan. Now, when is la'achar pidyonam? When it comes to bedek mizbeach, it's only, you can only redeem them after they have a blemish. So therefore, if we're comparing them, it must be, we're talking about after they're blemished. To which Rabbi Chizkiah, B'Shem Rabbi Yossi, now wants to bring a proof for the first opinion, that no, even if they're not blemished, you still can use the Vlad and the Chelev, and they don't have sanctity anymore. Why? If you're going to say they weren't, now, what does this mean? This is a little complicated, but when I sold you that korban ola, so now you're going to turn that animal into sanctified, right? You're going to say, I'm using this now for my korban. Now, if the sanctity didn't leave it, then you wouldn't be able to do it. You can't change, there's a law, you can't change kedushat bedek habayit to kedushat mizbeach. You can't just transfer one kedusha to another. It has to be chulin, like we saw before about buying the Torah. It had to be chulin in order to buy it. So here also, if they're going to take the animal and sanctify it for their korban, it had to have been chulin at some point. So therefore, it's obvious that the sanctity is entirely removed and they become chulin. Otherwise, there'd be no way for them to become sanctified. Okay, if you have a Baal Mum, now here's another case. Let's say, until now we were talking about animals that were unblemished. What if I say, any animal, this is all premised on the fact, okay, this whole daf is premised on the fact that in general, if I were to say, I'm sanctifying this animal to the temple, okay, that animal becomes kedushat haguf because it can go on the altar, it has to go on the altar, right? I can't do anything else with it. So now we say, what if it actually couldn't go on the altar from the beginning because it was blemished when I sanctified it? So ba'alei mumim, if I take an animal that's blemished and I say, I'm sanctifying this animal and sanctifying for the altar, okay? So now, I'm not allowed to do that. I can't sanctify an animal that's a blemished animal for the altar, but what if I did? So now they say there's a certain level of kedushat mizbeach that's on this animal. This animal is not just, you would assume, oh, maybe it defaults into, what you really meant is its value, but no. Well, for what layadamila, for what issue? Ligiza va'avodah. That means you're not allowed, if there's an animal that's sanctified to the temple, you can't use the shearings of the animal and you can't work the animal, use it for work purposes, right? To plow your field, let's say. So if I take a behemah, an animal that's blemished, and I sanctify it to the temple for the altar, which I'm not allowed to do, but if I do it anyway, it has sanctity of the altar to the extent that I cannot shear that animal and I cannot work that animal. Ifrish nikeva. Now we're moving topics. It's still within the same kind of general idea, but we're moving topics a little bit. And this relates to some stuff we learned in Masechet Pesachim. Ifrish nikeva. What if I took a female? Right? We talked before about a female can't be used as a korban ola. There's also other things a female can't be used for. Korban Pesach and a korban asham. They have to be male animals. So if I'm a frish nikeva, le'olato u'lepischo la'ashamo, I say I'm using this animal for an sacrifice that I can't use the female animal for. So again, it's like saying a blemished animal for a sacrifice, which I can't. Here also, it's not blemished, but it's not appropriate for this korban. So if I do that, we're going to see a three-way machloket as to what's its status. So again, the question is going to be, now they're going to word it a little differently, but I'll just tell you that the basic question is, again, Is it, and I really, these terms are mostly synonymous, is it kedushat damim, which means kedushat bedek habayit, or is it kedushat haguf, which means kedushat mizbeach? Even though I can't bring it on the altar, maybe it does have kedushat mizbeach. So what do they say? They say oset mura. Now they use a different terminology. Their terminology is, can it become a tmura? What's a tmura? That means, right, you're not allowed to replace this animal with anything else. That's a law. If you have an animal for the altar, you can't replace it. You can't say, I'm transferring the kedusha. That's the whole thing. You can only do it if it becomes blemished, then you can sell it, and then but you can't do pidyon otherwise. So if I say I'm bringing a different animal in its stead, what happens? The law is I'm not allowed to do that, but if I do, both become sanctified. Now the laws of Tmura only apply, and that's why I say they're using this really as a way of saying, is it kedushat haguf or is it kedushat damim? If its value, the body of the animal is sanctified, then there's a law of Tmura. You can obviously substitute something that's just kedushat bedek habayit, because what does that mean? Kedushat damim. It means only its value is sanctified, which of course means you can redeem it and put something in its stead. So if you say there's a law of Tmura, that means it has kedushat haguf. It itself is sanctified. So now they say, according to Tanakama, that is Tmura. Okay, it works. Tmura is effective because it's kedushat haguf, even though it's a female and it can't be used for that sacrifice. You still has kedushat haguf to it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he's going to split. Le'olato oset tmura, le'pischol hashamo eino oset tmura. Depends which one. For an ola, yes. For Pesach and Asham, no. We're going to see why in a minute. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer mishum Rabbi Shimon. This is a different opinion about Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is someone else, but he explains Rabbi Shimon differently than we saw it right now, which is la'olato le'pischol hashamo eino oset tmura. For none of them is it going to be tmura, meaning it's all just when you say a female for something it's not worthy for being, you really just mean I'm giving its value. Okay, and therefore, if you do tmura, it's not even effective. Forget that it's not forbidden; it's not even effective. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're going to do the reason for Rabbi Shimon. Tamad Rabbi Shimon shekem matzinu nekeva ba'of kshera lavo ola. Even though a female can't use the korban ola, there is one situation where you can, which is what? In a bird offering, you can have an ola in a bird offering. So therefore, since there's some concept of female by ola, we're going to assume it's kedushat haguf. It is sanctified, its body. But there's no female for Pesach and no female for Asham. Now, what about the second opinion about Rabbi Shimon? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Tamad Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who thinks there's no difference, even for females. So even for ola, what does he say? If when it's the same type, but something else is off, which we'll see in a minute, he doesn't think it has kedushat haguf, then it's just its value is sanctified. All the more so, female-male difference. Okay, now we're going to see what that is. What if, remember we learned this? The Asham has to be within a year, the first year, and so is the Pesach. What if you brought one that was 2 years? So according to Tanakama, it's fine. It works. Ben Shtayim, Behevi, Ben Shana. Okay, I'm changing the nusach here based on the graph. Ben Shtayim, Behevi, Ben Shana, Kasher. In other words, if you take a Pesach or an Asham and you use an animal that's too old, what happens? You can bring it on the altar. It's fine, meaning it's sanctified kedushat haguf, but you didn't fulfill your obligation of your Asham or your Pesach. But comes Rabbi Shimon. This is the important part. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol atzmam einam kedoshim. These aren't sanctified at all. If you bring a 2-year-old, it doesn't work. So now, if he thinks that's a min bimino, if he thinks a male that's the wrong year is not sanctified kedushat haguf, then all the more so female, he's not going to think of sanctified kedushat haguf. Even if there are female korbanot olah, it doesn't make a difference. There's also male ones that work. It's just you brought the wrong one and it's not sanctified. So obviously you would think the same there. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon, now you have to know it's Rabbi Shimon according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who says it's never sanctified. Rabbi Yoshua shnehem amru davar echad. How so? Kama de Rabbi Yoshua amar nekeva la'ola lo kicha ele hekdesh damim. Ken Rabbi Shimon omer nekeva la'ola lo kicha ele hekdesh damim. Remember what Rabbi Yoshua said? If you bring a female, what do? You sell it for a shlamim, and then you bring its value as an ola. So again, just its value, not its goof. Okay, so therefore he's going to agree with Rabbi Shimon that that's the same thing. It's a nikeva, was a female ola, and you don't bring it, right? You basically say it's not kedushat aguf, it's kedushat amim. You sell it, and with the money you buy an ola. So just like he said, nikeva ola lo kicha elek deshamim, came Rabbi Yeshua, where nikeva ola lo kicha elek deshamim. Both thought it was only its value. In Tamar, now how do you know he thought it was only its value? Because in Tamar kedushat aguf yiru. If they thought it itself was sanctified, what would you say? You have to leave it to graze until it gets a blemish, and then you can sell it. But what does he say? Rabbi Yeshua says, sell it right away. Not a problem. Okay, continuing now in the Breita. We quoted this Breita with these three opinions. Now this is the continuation of the Breita. Amar Rebbe. Ein ani ro'eh divrei Rabbi Shimon b'Pesach. Again, there's different Girsa issues here. I'm going to read based on what it says in my text here. I don't think Rabbi Shimon makes sense b'Pesach. Shemotar Pesach b'ashlamim. What do you mean a female? It's true a female can't be brought as a Pesach. But remember, what did we learn about Pesach and Masechet Pesachim? If you leave it over, it automatically becomes a shlamim, and a shlamim can be brought with a female. I see someone's asking, why are some male, why are some female? That's a very good question. The Torah says it very clearly. We don't know why the Torah says it, okay? But the Torah has strict instructions which korbanot can be brought from which animals. So that's basically what the Torah says. Try to give reasons, but it's just clearly stated in the Torah, whereas other laws aren't necessarily as clearly stated. This is very clearly stated. What age the animal has to be, what sex the animal has to be, that's all very clear. So he says, Motar Pesach can be shlamim, which means a Pesach potentially can be, a female can be brought, not as a Pesach, but as a shlamim, which if you leave it over from Pesach, it'll turn into a shlamim, and you can bring it. To which they respond and say, wait a minute, why did Rebbe say the following? Now in Asham, what do you do if you have an Asham left over? Let's say you separated an animal for an Asham and then you lost it and then you took a different animal in its place. What would you do? You would let the animal graze, you would take the money and you would buy with it a korban ola. So, and an ola, right? So an ola could be brought, remember we said, an ola could be brought with a bird, potentially could be female. So why didn't you say that? So you'll see these are not really the same, which is what the answer is. Amar Rabbi Avin, imikdish Pesach bashlamim, gufo karev shlamim, but imikdish Hasham ba'ola, ein gufo karev ola. There's a big difference between the Pesach automatically reverting that you could bring the animal itself as a korban shlamim versus taking the Asham, selling it and bringing with its value something else. That's not the same thing. And that's why I asked it specifically there. Now, again, I'm changing the nusach based on the gra. There's a little hay there that goes to the gra. Ma plige instead of mahu kidon. What's the machloket between them? Hahen amar. Okay, now we're talking about what's the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan. One second, between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi, right? Because Rabbi came in and said, remember, I'm a Rabbi. I think that in Pesach it would work. So what's the difference between them? Hahen amar hekdesh tamim hekdesh, vahen amar hekdesh gufo. It's a matter of what do you think he meant when he said it? When you say female for a Pesach, it's true that potentially you could bring it as a shlamim, but that's not really what you meant. According to Rabbi Shimon, you really meant, I just want to bring its value for a korban Pesach. You obviously didn't mean a Pesach. And Rebbe thinks, no, you really meant I want to bring it as Pesach, which really, it's true, it can't be a Pesach, but it could be a shlamim. That's the difference. Rabbi Zera b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Tama de Rabbi Yeshua. Now we finally get back to, I said we get back to it in the beginning. What's the reason for Rabbi Yeshua why he thinks everything automatically becomes an ola? And even the females can't be an ola, but you change them into money, right? You sell them to someone who needs to buy a shlamim, wants to bring a shlamim, and you take that money and you buy an ola. Where does he get this from? So we're going to quote a pasuk now from Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 18. Taber al Aharon ve'el banav ve'el kol bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem ish ish mibei Yisrael. They left out the important part, which is Asher yakriv korbano lechol nidrehem lechol nidvotam. Any voluntary offering. Asher yakriv laHashem leola. Any voluntary offering that you're going to bring to Hashem is an ola. There you have it. The default is an ola. Hakol karev leola. Now, what does it say in the next verse? Lirtzonchem tamim zachar. So therefore they said, maybe you would think only zachar, only male. So minayin afilu nikevot. How do we know that nikevot, again, it can't be brought for an ola, but you have to turn them into money, take that money and buy an ola. How do you know that? Tamud lamal. So the next pasuk says, Lirtzomchem tamim zachal, babakar bakvasim ubayizim. Babakar means all the cattle. Now, cattle includes male and female. So therefore, Babakar l'rabot et hanekevo. Rabbi Yitzchak le Rabbi Lazar Sha'al, he asked the following question. Ktiv zachar va'at amart babakar l'rabot et hanekevo. It said male. You now say that word bakar, cattle, is an inclusive word. That includes also females. But if that's the case, are you going to say also a baal mum? In other words, right, litzonchem tamim zachar. They have to be unblemished. Then all of a sudden, bakar includes everything. You're going to say maybe it includes unblemished animals. In other words, why are you saying bakar includes females, but it doesn't include unblemished animals? I'm sorry, it doesn't include blemished animals, ones with a blemish. So my benehon, so they say, what's the difference between them? Julie, I know you're going to like this one. Rav Amar, shifta de kirkada benehem. A weaver's rod is between them. In other words, you're comparing, I would say, more than apples and oranges, right? You're comparing apples and meat. I mean, you're comparing two totally different things. There's a weaver's rod between them. Why a weaver's rod? It separates between the warp and the weft. So what do you have, right? You basically are going to have this big split between them. You can't compare those things. And Nikeva can be brought as a sacrifice. That's why we're going to include it. But we're not going to bring blemished animals. It can't be brought as sacrifices at all. Okay, last part for today. Rabbi Elazar Omer Yimachlu L'Tzorchei Toamim. We're going to deal a lot more with this in tomorrow's shiur, but we'll start today, which is Rabbi Elazar had said if you have wines and birds and oil within all your possessions, sell it for someone who needs to bring that on the altar. And what are you going to do with it? Right? Then we say, Yavi b'demehem olot. Again, you're going to bring korbanot olah with the money. Rabbi Abba v'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Tama de Rabbi Elazar. What's his reason? Again, the same verse as Rabbi Yeshua. Taber al Aaron ve'el asher yakrivu la'Hashem la'olah hakol karev olah. Now, l'rtzonchem tamim zachar. Now, what would you think? Maybe the birds should also be sacrificed, just like the male animals. Why don't you sacrifice the male birds? Why do you sell them and then take the money to buy animals? Why don't you put the birds on? No, it says the cattle. Because it says cattle, it comes to exclude birds. And therefore, it has to be animal offerings. So therefore, you sell the birds and you use that money to buy animal olot. Okay, we'll end here for today. We'll pick up with the next line in tomorrow's shiur. Have a Modim Simcha and Shabbat Shalom.